Om Ajnanatimirandhasya Jnananjanashalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Presthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swamin Niti Namine. Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine. Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Narayanam Namaskritya Naram Chaiva Narottamam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jayamudirayet. In this session, we'll be discussing from the 46th verse of the 8th chapter of the first canto of Srimad-Bhagavatam. Vyasadyair Ishware Hajñai Krishnena Adbhuta Karmana Prabodhito Api Itihasair Na abudhyata shucharpitaha. The meaning of this verse is, King Yudhishthira, who was much aggrieved, could not be convinced despite instructions by great sages headed by Vyasa and the Lord Krishna himself, the performer of superhuman feats, and despite all historical evidence. So, it is being described here by Sutta Goswami that Yudhishthira was very much aggrieved for the huge massacre that had happened as a result of the battle of Kurukshetra. So Srila Prabhupada explains this elaborately in the purport. The pious king Yudhishthira was mortified because of the mass massacre of human beings in the battle of Kurukshetra, especially on his account. So it is explained why Yudhishthira was feeling very much aggrieved. Duryodhana was there on the throne and he was doing well in his administration. And in one sense, there was no need of fighting. Duryodhana was ruling nicely, though he was not entitled to the throne, but he was ruling nicely. And just because Yudhishthira was the rightful claimant for the throne, the whole battle of Kurukshetra was fought and millions were massacred, were killed in that battle. So Yudhishthira is thinking, for me to be enthroned as the emperor of the world, so much of massacre? It is not, he feels it is not justified. But on the principle of justice, Yudhishthira was to replace Duryodhana. The whole clique of politics centered around this point. And all the kings and residents of the whole world became involved in this fight between the rival brothers. Lord Krishna was also there on the side of King Yudhishthira. It is said in the Mahabharata, Adi Parva, that 640 million men were killed in the 18 days of the battle of Kurukshetra, and some hundreds of thousands were missing. Practically, this was the greatest battle in the world within 5,000 years. So, there is a detailed description in the Mahabharata about this entire episode of the battle, events leading to the battle. And it's a authentic historical record. This itihasa means history. And two famous itihasas based on the Vedic culture are the Ramayana and Mahabharata. So, as you are aware, Ramayana is the history of Lord Ramachandra, the incarnation of Supreme Lord, appearing on the earth and ruling the entire world from Ayodhya. And Mahabharata is the history of the Pandavas and Kauravas, and they're ruling the world. So Prabhupada further explains in the purport, this mass killing simply to enthrone Maharaj Yudhishthira was too mortifying. For whom? For Yudhishthira. So he tried to be convinced with evidences from histories by great sages like Vyasa and by the Supreme Lord Krishna himself that the fight was justified because the cause was just. So, justifying the fighting in spite of the huge number of people who died in this battle, in spite of that big number of deaths, the sages headed by Vyasa and Krishna himself, both of them, they wanted to pacify Yudhishthira and explain to him by historical evidence of previous instances where such big battles were fought for the sake of justice to prevail in this world. Duryodhana had occupied the post by cheating the Pandavas, by banishing them to the forest, by his so many tricks and by force. Though Yudhishthira was powerful, but he was just being very morally upright in every instance that Duryodhana cheated the Pandavas headed by Yudhishthira. So, after the battle, Krishna and these sages headed by Vyasa, they all tried to pacify and explain and convince Yudhishthira that Yudhishthira is not responsible for this killing. But Maharaj Yudhishthira could not be satisfied, even though he was instructed by the greatest personalities of his time. Somehow Yudhishthira was not convinced. And that will be described in the rest of this chapter, towards the end of this chapter, how Yudhishthira was not convinced that this battle was justified. Now, Krishna is being described in this verse as the performer of superhuman actions, adbhuta karmana, Krishnena adbhuta karmana. But in this particular instance of trying to convince Yudhishthira, neither Krishna nor Vyasa could convince King Yudhishthira. They could not. So, does it mean, Prabhupada is raising this point in the purport, does it mean that Krishna failed to be a superhuman actor? The answer is no, certainly not. How do we understand this? Krishna did not fail in his attempt to convince Yudhishthira. Why? Because Krishna is the Supreme Lord, he is the Ishvara, Supreme Controller, and he is seated as a super soul in the hearts of both King Yudhishthira and Vyasadeva. So, Krishna is in the background, but he is the Supreme Controller. He is the Supreme Controller. So, Krishna's purpose of Yudhishthira not getting convinced is that Krishna wanted to perform still more superhuman action. He wanted to perform still more superhuman action. As super soul of King Yudhishthira, Krishna did not allow King Yudhishthira to become convinced by the words of Vyasa and others, including himself. Because Krishna's desire was that Yudhishthira should hear instructions from the dying Bhishma Dev. Now, Bhishma was also another great devotee of the Supreme Lord Krishna, even though Bhishma was fighting on the opposite side. This is very, very unique situation. That Bhishma is great devotee. He has affection for the Pandavas. He knows the Pandavas' cause is just. Still, Bhishma had to fight on the side of Duryodhana. Now, the Supreme Lord Krishna also wanted that at the last stage of his material existence, the great warrior Bhishma Deva should see Krishna personally at the time of his quitting the body. And Bhishma should also see his beloved grandchildren, the Pandavas, and thus pass away very peacefully. Because Bhishma Deva was not at all satisfied to fight against the Pandavas. Why? Because he knew Pandavas' cause is just. So why should he fight against the Pandavas when he knows their cause is just? So Prabhupada explains the reason why Bhishma Deva was constrained to fight on the side of the Kauravas. The reason is the Kshatriyas are very stern people. And therefore, Bhishma Deva, he was obliged to take the side of Duryodhana. Why was he obliged to take the side of Duryodhana? Because Bhishma was maintained at the expense of Duryodhana. Now, elsewhere, Prabhupada explains that actually the kingdom belonged to Bhishma Deva. How is that? Bhishma was the eldest son of the emperor Shantanu. And the emperor, when he actually retired, this Shantanu, he was a forefather of the Pandavas and Kauravas. When he retired, Bhishma should have taken charge of ruling the whole world as the emperor. But because Shantanu wanted to marry one daughter of a fisherman, one Satyavati, it's a very long history. So Shantanu wanted to marry the daughter of a fisherman, Satyavati, but Satyavati's father refused because he calculated that the son born of my daughter through this emperor will not be able to inherit the post of the emperor because the elder son, Bhishma, is there. Already he has got a son through his first wife. So what is the use of marrying my daughter to this emperor? So he refused. This fisherman refused son Shantanu. Shantanu said, okay. But when Bhishma found out that my father has been refused, he went to the fisherman and said, what is the reason you are refusing to marry your daughter to my father? So then when the fisherman explained, Bhishma said, I forsake the claim to the throne. The son born of your daughter will be the next emperor. Then Bhishma thought that the fisherman will accept, but fisherman said, okay, the son born of my daughter will be the emperor, but after that son, your son will claim the throne of the whole world. Because you are forsaking, but he may not forsake. So then Bhishma agreed to remain a brahmachari, not to marry. And that way, Shantanu was able to marry that fisherman's daughter, Satyavati. So, Bhishma actually was the one who was supposed to rule the whole world, but he voluntarily gave up for the sake of his father. Therefore, Bhishma is not actually a dependent, not really a dependent. But he assumed a humble position that Duryodhana maintained me, and so he fought on the side of the Kauravas. I'll stop here. Thank you very much. Hare Krishna.